greatest ploughing season in British history is now in full swing. Farmers are ploughing by day and they're ploughing by night.
In 1939, the countryside went to war. To help feed the nation, traditional farms all over Britain would be revolutionised, with the horse-drawn plough replaced by the tractor.
I have driven the tractor 18 hours a day for a week after a week after a week. And nobody was standing beside me with a gun or a whip saying, you know, I'd done it off my own bat, but then you had to.
New recruits from the towns and cities were drafted in to boost the war effort in the countryside. Many of them, like the land girls and the lumberjills, were volunteers doing what, until then, was strictly men's jobs.
You didn't realise what type of work it was. I mean, it was all new to you. It just sounded very glamorous to be working out in the home and felling trees, but you didn't know what that meant, actually.
Not everybody was as cooperative, however. German POWs who were used as forced labour to work in the countryside resented the idea of contributing to the British war effort.
They hated English, you know, it's no two ways about it. The atmosphere was electric, you know, I can tell you.
The sinking of hundreds of British merchant ships by German U-boats posed a major threat to the food imports on which the nation's survival depended. To avoid being starved into submission, the British countryside needed to double its food production. It was an extraordinary challenge. This is the story of the countryside's finest hour. When the war began, agriculture up and down the country was dominated by small, mixed farms that had changed little for generations. The countryside was simply not geared up to produce large quantities of essential foods, like cereals and wheat. Much of this was imported. The war government realised urgent action was needed.
The Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries has appointed a War Agricultural Executive Committee for each county in England and Wales. They will be given as free a hand as possible to increase the production of foodstuffs in their areas. Their immediate task is to see that additional land is brought under the plough with all speed.
One of the small farms facing this new challenge was run by Eric Higgs and his father in Cornwall. Eager to do his bit for his country, Eric wanted to abandon the farm and join the RAF. But when his family found out, Eric's older brother, who'd already joined the forces, hastily took leave and came home to convince Eric to stay on the farm.
He turned up in the middle of the night, brother did. He said, I spoke to my CO and he said, Sergeant Higgs, he said, go back to the little farm in Cornwall. This was the words he used. Go back to the little farm in Cornwall and tell your brother to stay where he is. He's doing a far more important job on that farm than he would in any infantry regiment. Which is common sense, right? Because the food had to be produced.
An intensive army recruitment and conscription campaign at the beginning of the war emptied the countryside of young farm workers. Eric Duxbury was one of those called up, but bad eyesight meant he couldn't become a regular soldier.
I was no use, really, as a soldier because of my eyesight. I thought me far better working on the land. And that's how I found out that there was such a thing as a soldier gardener, and that even there was such a thing as the Army Agricultural Scheme.
The official war drive to cultivate all unproductive land also affected the vast areas taken over by the government for military purposes. This is where Eric saw his opportunity to become a soldier gardener.
I wrote and I put, food production is important and I think I can do it better than being or trying to be a soldier.
Farming was made a reserved occupation in wartime, ensuring countrymen remained where they were needed most. But agriculture was still desperately short of manpower to undertake the revolution in production that was essential if Britain was to become self-sufficient in food. One answer was the Women's Land Army, which recruited young women from the cities onto the farms.
Good evening. You're half an hour late.
Despite the frosty welcome they often received, these volunteer land girls did their bit in the countryside with an enthusiasm that took locals by surprise. Within months, there would be thousands of land girls working on farms all over Britain and learning the hard way. Land Army girl Beatrice Williams left London to work on a farm near Exeter. She soon found the farm horses were as suspicious towards outsiders as the farmers themselves.
The horses immediately got hold of their head by the halter or by their bridle. They knew that you knew nothing about them. They just knew it. And they wouldn't get into their carts. When you had to back them in between shafts, they'd always get 1 foot outside. Well, of course, we were speaking to them in our own voices. But you soon discovered that if you tried to copy the men and what they said to the horses, they would do what we wanted them to. So we started to swear. And they were much easier to manage once you tried to do that. You know, they understood the words, you see.
I'll have to get that down quick. I'm on duty tonight.
An added burden for farm workers faced with the pressure to produce more food was home guard duties, which had to be done to protect the countryside. After the fall of France in the summer of 1940, preparations for an imminent German invasion put coastal areas in the front line. The beaches were protected with barbed wire, mines and machine gun posts. Country life was clouded by an atmosphere of fear.
Good night, though.
Good night, Pa.
The feeling we had, you know, I mean, people would laugh today, press, but you never knew, you see. And the way they were talking, these paratroopers could be coming down as you was walking across the field. You know, it was that likely. We walked around those farms for 2 hours before dusk and 2 hours before dawn, because they said that's the likely times when they're coming in. Everybody, I'm sure, and I know I talked to a lot of them, they were in the Home Guard particularly, had almost a constant stomachache. Fear. Fear.
In the summer of 1940, the war hung in the balance. The countryside faced the threat of a German invasion, and there was a very long way to go before Britain could get anywhere near being able to grow the food it needed to survive. In the summer of 1940, the RAF fought the Battle of Britain in the skies over southern England, while on the farms all over the country, everyone did their bit, gathering in the harvest. Victory for the RAF over the Luftwaffe spared the countryside the threat of a German invasion, but Hitler now had a new strategy to win the war. He aimed to use his powerful U-boat fleet to sink the merchant ships carrying food into Britain and starve her into submission. The hot, dry summer of 1940 saw an increase of 10% on the pre-war harvest, but this was well short of the survival plans to feed the nation. New government targets were immediately set to bring 2 million more acres of newly ploughed arable land into production. The plan was then presented to the farmers.
Well done. What can you give me? Say 20 acres?
Yes, 20. 18 of another field, and 5 or 6 in another field, which I might be able to break up later on.
The official scheme to transform agriculture was viewed with scepticism by many farmers. To win them over, the government gave subsidies for every acre of land that was reclaimed, but refusing to take part in the scheme was not an option.
The government simply said, we've got to increase the acreage of cereals from your county in this next harvest. You see that it's planted. So that went down to my father's department. So he had to see that it was planted, you see? And then it came from that down to the blokes that done the work, which was me. Ploughed the fields, drilled the corn.
War Agricultural Committee officials visited every farm in the country to make sure that every last farmer was drawn into the war effort. The productivity of each farm was assessed, and new individual targets were drawn up by the so-called War Ag committees.
I can remember the War Ag as they called themselves, walking in on our farm, and they were all dressed in posh suits, and they said they were going to bring in a ditcher. And I, being a child, didn't really know what they were on about. It was a ditcher, what we'd call a ditcher, but they were posh. They said a ditcher.
For independent-minded small farmers like Angela's father, the government scheme smacked of bureaucracy. Even when the reclaiming of unproductive land was taking place all around their family farm, he still refused to do as he was told.
We'd been told we had to plant in what we called locally the black soils. It was fertile, but it was boggy. You couldn't put potatoes in that. And having been told we'd got to do that, father and uncle and my grandma, who'd farmed there for quite a time, they said no, it wasn't good farming and they couldn't do that. So they got a bit stroppy and they said, well, we'll take 130 acres from you and you can have the house and 20 acres. So we agreed.
To achieve their ambitious targets for food production, the government schemes relied heavily on the mechanisation of agriculture. But there was a problem. Tractors were in very short supply in 1941, as Eric Duxbury discovered when he finally got the chance to be a soldier gardener.
When I went to the officer, he said, "Can you drive a tractor?" And I said, "Yes." Probably couldn't, but I said yes. And he said, "Pack your kit, going down to Rotherham." So I thought, oh, I better find out before I go whether I actually can drive a tractor. So I found the farm worker at the farm at the top and asked him how to do it all, how to start it and what he had to do, thinking I was going to get a tractor when I got down to Rotherham. But I got to Rotherham and I was given a spade and told to dig in the garden.
For Land Army girls like Audrey Witter and her friends, war work in the countryside wasn't quite what they'd expected. Having coped with the London Blitz, they thought they'd seen it all. Until one day in 1942, when they arrived at a remote farm in Norfolk.
We ended up at this big farmhouse, a place where you had to go to bed with a candle. There was no electricity up there at all. We had candles, you know.
Early the next morning, it was about to get a whole lot worse.
Well, the first job we ever got was we had to be up at 5. We had to feed the animals, you know. And then we were told to go and clean out this sow in this pigsty place. It was all dark in there. We both looked, got in there, a terrible smell, so I said to Peggy, I'll go and get our gas mask.
There was no escaping the realities of the war, even on an isolated farm. A nagging feeling of dread was always at the back of Audrey's mind. Her boyfriend, Eric, was secretly training in an RAF bomber squadron, and he wasn't allowed to reveal his whereabouts to her in his letters.
He knew he was going overseas somewhere to be trained like they were. He gave me a code. If he put Darling Audrey, that was Canada. If he put, say, Dearest Audrey, when he wrote to me, that was South Africa. And another one was Australia, and another one was America. Of course, I forgot, didn't I? When they arrived, I still didn't know where he was.
But when the Women's Land Army began recruiting lumberjills to work in the forests, Glaswegian Christine Paul, a former model, volunteered. The job was tougher than she had ever imagined.
Travelling to the woods, and sometimes a very long distance, we'd keep our morale up by singing our song. One in particular we would sing was, "Hello, hello, we are the Lumberjills. Hello, hello, we are the Lumberjills. Up to the knees in great big trees, everywhere you go. We are the merry Lumberjills." You didn't realise what type of work it was. I mean, it was all new to you. It just sounded very glamorous, and be working out in the open and felling trees, but you didn't know what that meant, actually, that you had to swing a 6-pound axe to lay in before you felled the tree and use a 8-foot crosscut saw. Your hands were all blistered and you used to cut yourself, and get your legs knocked, your knees knocked, your shin bone black and blue.
Here comes the car, Mary. I do hope it's a nice, clean child.
Country people often viewed the newcomers from the cities with suspicion, and children were no exception. Over 1 million boys and girls were evacuated from the danger zones to the relative safety of the villages, and many ended up on small farms, like that run by the Higgs family in Cornwall.
Mother, is the new visitor?
We were notified, my mother and all the farmers' wives, to be down in the village by a certain time, and the evacuees would be arriving by coach from the train in Mobilizing, near station. They duly arrived. I drove my mother up in the car, and after about, I suppose, half an hour, perhaps a bit more, I expect, talking and that, they decided which ones they were going to bring home. And she chose these 2 little boys. And in the car, and we came home, you see. And they were crying, their eyes were full of tears, oh, they were in some state. And they got indoors, you see, and they wanted to spend a penny. And they couldn't. Nerves. She believed, I remember that mother coming and said, Dad, she said, or Leonard, she called him, see, Leonard said, they're so bad that they can't wee.
The Higgs treated their evacuees with great kindness. Very soon they introduced the boys to some of the fun of the farm.
They would follow me around to feed the hens and pick up the eggs. You know, you pick up the eggs in a bucket or a pail, put the corn out, pick up the eggs. And of course, they loved doing this. We were walking up across to wait for lunch, and we heard this. And there was these 2 boys taking off the blinking hens to a T. They could take them off to a T, and they only been on the farm 2 days, and they'd never seen a hen in their life.
The British farmer today is also a mechanic, an engineer working on the land. To his inborn knowledge of soil and climate, of crops and livestock, he has had to add a knowledge of gears and carburetors, of sprockets and sparking plugs. And just as farmers and their wives used to flock to horse fairs and cattle shows, so today they come in crowds to demonstrations of farm machinery.
Britain's tractor fleet was growing rapidly. By 1943, there were around 150,000 tractors used on farms up and down the country, almost 3 times the figure when war began. For Eric Duxbury, it was a dream come true. He was given his own tractor, and it was love at first sight.
I learned all about the Forestry tractor and what to do with it. And I liked it. It was easy to start, easy to drive. It did everything that you expected of it. And I drove the tractor all the time. Nobody else. Nobody touched the tractor, only me. And I loved it so much. I almost lived on the tractor. 12, 14-hour days were regular things because the acres were there and they wanted them ploughing.
These tractors meant that more and more land could be put under the plough. For Eric Higgs, this led to working even longer hours.
As it gets darker and darker at night, of course your eyes accustomed. We had no lights on the tractors. On the old standard Fordsons, there was no lights. But we picked the moonlight, and it's surprising what you can see in good starlight. For some jobs. You couldn't do everything, but you could do some jobs. It was rough mind, it was hard going. But you got into the technique of it, and being young, you could do anything, really. Great about the tractor was that you, at the end of the day, or whenever you stopped, you'd done 3 times as much work as you'd done with horses.
Land girls also became tractor drivers as part of this wartime agricultural revolution, overcoming male prejudice as well as their own personal doubts and fears.
First time you sit in a tractor, I was a bit terrified in a sense. I'd go and let it run away with me or something. It was something so different, and after a while you found it enjoyable, at least I did, except when you were trying to put an implement on the back in the cold weather and you couldn't feel your fingers.
After several months behind the wheel, Beatrice Williams mastered the art of tractor driving.
Most of us were persistent. We were determined not to let the end down, not to let females, be laughed at too much, because we were really serious about what we were doing.
By the summer of 1943, the countryside was looking forward to a bumper harvest. But with the spirit of wartime unity growing and the scars of the German bombs marking the landscape, there was little sympathy for independent farmers who resisted government controls. They were simply seen as not pulling their weight. The defiance of Angela Aldington's father meant the family were threatened with eviction, but he was still in no mood for compromise.
My father's maxim was, your home is your castle. Therefore, no way, they can't do this. Now, Uncle and Grandma and my mother said, Oliver, sometimes you have to hold the candle to the devil. No way, this is ours and we own it.
In the end, Angela's family were evicted from their farm. There were 15,000 of these wartime evictions in this drive to modernise farming.
Anyone who was turned out, as we were considered to be bad farmers. I mean, obviously, the authorities wouldn't turn you out unless you were no good at it. And so we had to bear that stigma. I can remember Father coming out of the house with a blanket over his head, and he wouldn't look left nor right. He just went in a straight line to our old Singer car. He was I should imagine he was sobbing, because most of us were actually. It was terrible.
In 1943, the mood all over Britain was changing. The country had survived the bombing of its big cities, and it was now in a position to take the war to Germany. There were calls for revenge, whipped up by propaganda newsreels.
You don't hear anybody saying, we can take it now. Why? Not because it isn't true, but the war has moved on, and the phrase which fits our present sentiment is, they've got it coming to them. They, that is the Germans, have got it coming to them.
For Audrey Witter, the news that her boyfriend's bomber squadron had gone into operation over Germany came as no surprise.
I used to write to him every day, and he used to write to me every day. And that's how I knew he was on operations, because he wrote to me and said to me, don't the Alps look lovely bathed in moonlight? I knew then that he was on, that's how he let me know that he'd gone on operations.
Nevertheless, the determination of everyone to do their bit was greater than ever.
We're all in it together, we're all pulling together. We were told we were down to 10 days' food at one time. So, I mean, we knew jolly well we were really doing something for the country.
In 1943, the weather was set fair for a record harvest. But the countryside was about to face even greater challenges in which more sacrifice, and for some more heartbreak, was inevitable. But bringing in this bumper crop before any bad weather spoilt it would prove to be a difficult and exhausting challenge. There were now around 2,000 new combine harvesters which cut, gathered and threshed the corn all in one operation. However, much of the corn was still cut in the traditional way using a binder. This meant the harvest involved long hours of back-breaking manual labour.
The binder would cut the corn. It had to be ripe. It had to be dry. It would rustle in the wind when it's dry. One man on the binder. The rest of the men would be putting the sheaves from the binder all up in shocks like that to dry in rows.
The Women's Land Army was part of this resurgence of British wartime agriculture. By 1943, there were more than 80,000 land girls working in a great variety of jobs to increase food production. It was tough for them too, and bringing in the harvest, like most jobs they did, was not quite as romantic as newsreels made it out to be.
You pick up the sheaves and you get stinging nettles and thistles in your hands. It wasn't really pleasant doing that. That barley was terrible. It had long whiskers on it, and you used to get in your shirt and you used to itch. Oh dear, it was dreadful. That, and it got filthy dirty. Your hair was filthy, you were always dirty. It was fun though, we enjoyed it.
The drive to mechanise farming was changing the countryside, but this didn't stop farmers and their families holding on to age-old traditions, like summer meals in the fields.
My mother, the farmhouse was about, I suppose, 300 or 400 yards down from one of the top fields I'm thinking about now. And she would always shout when it was dinner time. All she would say was, whoop, whoop, like that. She had the technique, and most farmers' wives done the same thing exactly. You would hear this, whoop, 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 all about 12:30, 1:45, dinner's ready. See, so immediately you heard of that, because you could hear it with the horses, no sound. When you had the tractor, you couldn't hear it. So you had to judge it. See, you Jenny, she's come to the field a little way, or someone waved something.
It was the rituals of the summer harvest that were often most memorable to newcomers to the countryside, who soon came to appreciate nature's bounty. George Hayes, who was evacuated from London and spent his early teens in Monmouthshire, remembers the excitement of the rabbit shoots. As the wheat fields were cut down, the rabbits hid from the binders and retreated to the ever-diminishing circle of standing corn.
The harvester would go round and round the field in ever-decreasing circles, and we'd all wait for the rabbits to come out and try and kill them. And shotguns, and that's what always got me. There'd be shotguns going off. How any of us never got bloody well killed, because there were shotguns going off from one side of the circle to the other. I can only remember it as fun, not as work.
During the peak times of harvesting and haymaking, the ranks of the farm workers and land girls were swelled by large numbers of civilian and military volunteers giving up their spare time to lend a hand. The hours were very long, but the wartime spirit of cooperation made it all seem worthwhile. And with Britain becoming more self-sufficient in food, there were now a few little luxuries left over for the farm labourers to enjoy too.
We used to work till midnight because we had double daylight savings for the farmers, and I'd been haymaking at midnight with bright moon, you know, wonderful. It was quite a gentle job, really. They'd stop you off halfway and you'd have a cup of tea and possibly a piece of cake, and then we'd go into the farm. There was 3 times it happened to me. Got this gorgeous spread, just like I'd never seen it before. I'd never lived on a farm. Bowls of cream, strawberries, all sorts of things.
The fun and the friendship that surrounded the harvest helped take everyone's mind off the grim reality of the war, but not for long. In the back of her mind, Audrey was always worrying about her boyfriend Eric, who served in the RAF's Bomber Command. When she got the news that he was shot down and killed during a nighttime bombing raid over Germany, the shock was overwhelming.
I was absolutely numbed. It's an extraordinary feeling, you know. You feel empty, there's nothing there. Most peculiar it was.
Knowing how dangerous the bombing raids over Germany were, Eric tried to prepare Audrey for the worst the last time he came home on leave.
He said to me, "Promise me something." I said, "What's that?" He said to me, "Don't ever mourn for me." He said, "You find somebody else." And you know, that really broke my heart. That's when I cried. But when it happened, I was completely and absolutely shattered. I don't know, just nothing there.
But Audrey just had to keep going. There was a job to be done, and a war to be won.
Well, I just went to work the next day, and I just never said a word to a soul. We just didn't talk about it. You couldn't. It goes so deep, you can't talk about it.
Newsreels did their best to boost any flagging morale.
The tall forests of the Scottish Highlands today echo the acts not of the woodman, but of the wood girl. The girls all say they're fitter than they've ever been. The companionship and open air suit them down to the ground, and they know they're really doing something to help to win the war.
Perhaps the hardest and most dangerous job of all in the countryside was undertaken by the 4,000 lumberjills of the Women's Timber Corps. They worked alongside professional woodsmen, battling to meet the shortfall in timber supplies brought about by severe difficulties importing wood from overseas. After a shaky start, lumberjills like Christine Paul became as skilled at felling trees as the men.
We had to fell 30 trees a day. You couldn't cheat because the forester took a piece of bark off each tree. So if there was a tree left standing with a piece of bark, so obviously you didn't fell it. When you're felling on a hill, you fell across the hill. But depending where you lay in and where you wanted the tree to fall, you became experts at it. And a tree fell and it sailed down. And you used to write bloody good on the stamp if it was a difficult one, and you had to number the trees that you fell, you'd keep touch. But it was just constantly working with them. You acquired all the skill. In fact, we were better than some of the woodmen. We had a better knack. It's the rhythm in the saw, not leaning on it.
In the summer of 1944, renewed German air attacks from across the Channel threatened to disrupt the approaching harvest season. The danger now came from Hitler's latest weapon of terror, the V-1 flying bomb, known in Britain as the doodlebug. Around 10,000 were fired towards London, but many were shot down or fell short over the rural southeast of England, making it a war zone again.
We were all issued with tin hats, but none of us wore them, because if you wore a tin hat and you bent down, it banged you on the nose. So we used to leave them hanging up on the trees. So they didn't do much good. That and our gas mask, a whole row of girls hanging on the trees. We never wore them.
The engines on these missiles cut out randomly, causing them to plummet to the ground.
They were a damn nuisance, they really were, because they used to be coming and you never knew when they were going to drop. If they stopped, that was when they were going to drop, and they used to go down wallop like that.
The warheads were so powerful they damaged houses within a quarter of a mile radius, killing anyone nearby.
Our farm got bombed 2 or 3 times, but only blew up the cabbages and stuff. It didn't hurt us.
As well as the air attacks, bad weather and a shortage of labour added to the difficulties in gathering in the 1944 harvest. However, greater Allied military success overseas meant there was a new but less reliable source of labour available to use in the countryside: German prisoners of war.
At one of the camps somewhere in Britain, ex-German sailors saved from sunken U-boats and ex-German airmen whose planes were brought down are learning to start life afresh in more peaceful jobs.
Italian POWs had been employed on the land from early on in the war. But for the 1944 harvest, the Ministry of Agriculture asked for an initial 36,000 German prisoners to be made available in the countryside. Cornish farmer Eric Higgs was about to come face to face with the enemy for the first time.
I was dead curious to see what a blooming German looked like. Well, I was threatening to slit his throat for the last 6 years. So I went over there. And the look on their faces was absolutely, not imploring exactly, but bewildered. They looked so terrible. It's only fun. Oh yeah, they started it with... Never mind. The poor sods, they were white, they were staring, they didn't know what happened. They had no country, it was in ruins, the whole economy was gone, they didn't know where their families was, their wives, their kids. What a situation. And they were supposed to work.
Most German POWs, however, were greeted with suspicion and resentment, especially Nazi loyalists. In a spirit of revenge, it was easy to condemn them all out of hand.
Many of them are found to carry dangerous-looking knives with blades that shoot out.
Peter Roth, a German soldier captured in June 1944, resented the way they were treated in a POW camp on arrival in Britain.
The atmosphere was electric, I can tell you. They took all our money away, they took everything what we had, and the flashpoint came when they burned the photos. That was the point, when I got boiling point.
The newsreels mocked the German prisoners as they were set to work.
Here, German prisoners of war are forced to cultivate the fields they once hoped to devastate.
However, Peter was determined to do nothing to assist the British war effort.
They dropped us on the farm to pick the carrots. And as out of principle, I wouldn't do nothing. So I picked the carrots very carefully on my 2 fingers, you know, and just to pick, so that my hands didn't get dirty. So the guard, you know, didn't like my attitude, you see, and he put his gun by me, let's go, you know, and picked me in the up. I said, well, pick the bloody things yourself. You know, I said it in German, of course, you see.
German POWs who were low risk and cooperative were often allowed to live on farms under strict military supervision, and Eric Higgs soon chose the one he wanted.
I had that German Silesian farmer's son for the rest of the war. I said, that's the man I want every day. He was about 8 years older than me, and he came with me, and he was an expert farmer, so no doubt about that.
Eric and his POW Richard, seen here sitting on the tractor beside him, soon became very good friends.
He told me about his life in Germany before the war, which was just very similar to my life, really, very similar. And how he managed, he was very stoic, if that's the word, to control himself, not knowing where his wife and boy was. I mean, you know, could I have worked? I don't think I could have worked. But he did. I think was to take the mind off the situation.
But Peter Roth was still refusing to work properly. Then when a guard was not paying much attention, Peter got very friendly with 2 girls in a gang who were picking vegetables close by him. It would prove a turning point in his attitude toward the British.
One of the girls now gave me a piece of cake, you know, and a Turkish cigarette. You see, wonderful, you see. And that was it. So in that night, I went and I pinched all the snowdrops I could find in the camp. The next day, luck was with us, we got the same guard again. And I took to one of the girls, what took my fancy, and give it a tiny bunch of snowdrops. The first bouquet I gave her.
It was love at first sight, and Peter and his new sweetheart Margaret were soon stealing moments to be together. But fraternization with the enemy was illegal. They were reported to the authorities, and Peter was sent away, despite the fact he'd become a model worker. They were determined to see each other again.
After a while, I persuaded her not to come to see me. Well, of course, I mean, you know, it was a very, very hard task, you know, to ask a girl, you know, to come to see me on a prison camp. The risk, you know, involved, you know, is absolutely immense. I loved the girl. I mean, I tried to love her. I mean, she was in a terrible position, and for me, it was a mountain to climb.
By early 1945, the dark days of the war were over and an Allied victory looked assured. This would have a dramatic effect on the lives of everyone in the countryside, including Peter and Margaret, whose secret love still hung very much in the balance. When the war ended in the summer of 1945, the countryside could rightly celebrate the important role it had played in the final victory. There were lavish harvest suppers in almost every village and market town the length and breadth of Britain. But there were also sad farewells. When Beatrice Williams left the Land Army, she had to say goodbye to the many good friends she'd made.
We had that one big thing in common. We'd all done those awful jobs. We'd all suffered in the winters and enjoyed the summers. It was rather like saying goodbye to a group of sisters. You know, when some of the girls left, obviously some left to get married, some left to take up other work, and they were all very upset when they were all leaving. We all were. You know, it was just like a little community. all breaking up.
In 1946, the Women's Timber Corps was disbanded and the lumberjills returned to their jobs in the cities to be replaced by men. Despite the harsh life they'd endured in remote woodlands and forests, they too had no regrets about their war work.
You missed the camaraderie of the people. You'd adjust to the rules and regulation of home and missed running about wild. And it was extremely difficult to adjust to civilian life. It was a period of your life you'll never forget. We did work very hard for very little money, but I wouldn't have missed it because it was glorious in the morning getting up and going into the woods in spring or summer and the dew in the ground.
Those who'd helped drive the mechanisation of agriculture during the war years felt a lasting sense of achievement. Soldier gardener Eric Duxbury had helped boost production on farms and land requisitioned by the army all over Yorkshire.
I'm not a Coldstream garb. I was a pioneer. Because of my eyesight, I considered I was doing the right thing. I think I could never shoot a German. I do know that I had the choice of either feeding somebody or trying to be a soldier or something that I didn't know anything about, and I didn't like anyway. But I was very keen on producing food. I thought it was great.
In 1946, up to 1/5 of all farm work was still being done by German POWs, of whom there were now 400,000 in Britain. On Eric Higgs's farm in Cornwall, POW Richard still had no word about the whereabouts of his wife and son. He waited patiently for news from the German day workers who came past the farm every morning from the local POW camp.
The lorry that carried the workers, the day workers in from the camp to the farms, came by my farm every day. And he'd slow down, and if there was no news, they would simply say, "Richard!" They'd shout them across the field, about 100 yards. "Richard!" They always pronounce it Richard. "Richard! It's nicht post!" There's no post. There's no post. And he would look away, see, and he wouldn't know what to do for a minute, then he would get over it and go on again. And this went on and on and on.
Repatriation proved to be a slow process, but not all the German prisoners wanted to go back home. Thousands had grown to like Britain, and some had enjoyed romances. Despite all the obstacles, Peter and Margaret's relationship continued to blossom.
As far as I was concerned, you see, for me, war's finished, you know, and that's it. I mean, I didn't want to go into war, and neither did the English people. We was forced to go in, and that is it. And when the war's finished, out. Let's be friends, and this is how I took it.
Peter and Margaret married in 1948, had 2 children and lived happily ever after together in Peterborough. In 1946, on Eric Higgs's farm, POW Richard finally received the good news he'd been waiting for.
Before the lorry stopped, the dozen or so prisoners that was in the back of the lorry was hollering and shouting and held up, like, you know, what's going on? See? So excited, because they'd had some news. "Richard, it's post in camp for C." That's for you. "It's post in camp for you."
Richard went to the camp where he was given a letter from his wife informing him that both she and their son were safe. In 1948, Richard returned to Germany, but he and Eric's family remained close, lifelong friends. The countryside would never be quite the same again. The newcomers brought new ideas and attitudes that changed everyone. The wartime agricultural revolution too left a lasting legacy of mechanization and greater productivity that would in years to come transform the countryside forever. But most of all, there was also a proud, lasting memory of the farmer's finest hour.